She had the nerve to call his hand-built bridge community property, but when she sent yet another cement truck over it, Trenton Vale was ready. He was about to show her precisely where her authority ended, and it was nowhere near his land because the bridge didn't simply give out. It splintered with the crack of a gunshot. One moment, the cement truck was crawling across, its heavy tires groaning against the wooden plank. The next, its rear axle plunged straight through, swallowed by a deep pool of clay and water as the crash echoed through the hollow like thunder. A geyser of mud erupted, splattering high enough to completely coat the driver's windshield as the startled man leaped from the cab. His boots were instantly devoured by the sludge as he yelled, "What in the world is this?" From his porch, Trenton Vale didn't flinch, he just watched. Arms folded, his face a mask of calm. The faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. To any other observer, it looked like a freak accident. But Trenton knew better. He had spent the past week orchestrating this exact moment. The frantic truck driver tried gunning the engine, but the back tires only spun deeper, and the acrid smell of burnt rubber filled the morning air as birds scattered from the surrounding trees. The racket drew neighbors out onto their lawns. One woman covered her mouth in shock. Another whispered, "That's Trenton's bridge, isn't it?" Judith Bramwell arrived within minutes, her SUV screeching to a halt in front of Trenton's house as she stepped out, clipboard in hand, always with that damned clipboard, wearing her customary navy blazer despite the sweltering heat. Her voice sliced through the air like broken glass. "Mr. Vale, what on earth have you done?" Trenton didn't grant her an immediate answer. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his coffee mug, then walked down the steps, the old wood creaking under his boot. "Funny," he said, his voice even. "I was just about to ask you the same thing." A tide of red flushed Judith's face. "This is destruction of private property. You will be paying for this," she seethed. But Trenton's tone remained perfectly level. "Private property," he repeated thoughtfully. "You mean mine?" The truck driver, a young man with a Tennessee accent as thick as molasses, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Ma'am, I was just told this was the shortcut to the new construction site on Willow Bend Road." He pointed toward the other side of the creek, where fresh tire marks led directly from Judith's property line. "I had no idea it was somebody's private yard." Trenton kept his eyes locked on her. "And who precisely told you that?" The driver hesitated. "The lady, the one who runs the HOA." For a tense second, the only sound was the truck's engine sputtering in the mud. Then, Judith's voice dropped to a venomous hiss. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Trenton looked past her, his gaze falling on the ruined bridge, where water glistened beneath the broken planks. Sunlight bounced off the wet clay. "No," he said softly, "just tired." Behind them, the neighbors had gathered closer, forming a silent semicircle of spectators pretending not to stare. Everyone knew about Judith. Everyone knew about her official warnings, her passive-aggressive letters, and her friendly reminders about lawn heights and fence colors. No one had ever dared challenge her. Until now, Judith marched right up to him, her heels sinking slightly into the damp grass. "This is utterly unacceptable. I'll have the county involved by noon. You can be sure you'll be hearing from our lawyers." Trenton didn't even blink. He pulled a small folder from under his arm, opened it, and held it out for her to see. Inside were official maps, photographs, and boundary records. The top page was clearly marked with an official county stamp. "You might want to take a look at this," he suggested, "before you start making those calls." He said, "That bridge, it's on my land, every single inch. The trucks you sent through it were trespassing. I have photographs, dates, and even video evidence. I did try to warn you." Judith was momentarily paralyzed. She was unaccustomed to adversaries arriving so thoroughly prepared. Her gaze darted between the dossier and the splintered bridge as the driver stood by, shifting uncomfortably. Kicking mud from his work boots, she seethed. "You orchestrated this. You wanted this to happen." Trenton's voice dropped to a low, chilling tone. "No, you made this happen. I simply built something to show you precisely where my property line is." The driver scratched his neck, asking, "So, am I clear to phone my boss, or?" A half-smile touched Trenton's lips. "You should probably tell him to bring a tow rig. That truck isn't going anywhere." A few stifled chuckles rippled through the onlookers. Judith spun on her heel, fuming, her face matching the crimson of her lipstick. She stomped back toward her SUV, muttering about violations and filing reports, while Trenton turned and headed back to his port. But as he walked, his gaze fell once more on the ruined bridge. Only a week ago, It had been perfectly intact. He could still hear the sound of it splintering, not from the truck, but from the time before, when Judith had brazenly ignored his every warning. He recalled the morning the first boards cracked under another heavy load, the very day he realized he could no longer stand by and do nothing. He looked down at his hands. They were rough and calloused, but unwavering, the same hands that had built that bridge from nothing. But to understand how it all led to this, the trap, the shattered bridge, the public humiliation, you must first understand how the conflict began. Long before anyone in the neighborhood knew his name, Trenton Vale was just another man attempting to build something for himself. He had grown up in Memphis, the eldest of 3 brothers, raised by a father who believed that if something was broken, you fixed it with your own 2 hands. That lesson became ingrained in him. By the time Trenton was 40, he had saved enough to purchase a small piece of land outside Clarksville, Tennessee. It was a place where the city's din dissolved into the soft hum of cicadas and the whisper of leaves in old oak trees. His house was unassuming, a 1-story brick home with a narrow porch and a well-worn rocking chair. A flagstone path led directly to the creek. The property had been sorely neglected when he bought it. The fences were leaning, and the grass had run wild, and the bridge that crossed the creek was barely holding together. Most people would have called a contractor. Trenton just grabbed his toolbox. That bridge became his personal mission, not just a structure over water, but a declaration. He devoted every weekend to its revival. He measured, sanded, stained, and reinforced each beam himself, using cedar planks from a lumber yard over in Dover, the kind of wood that could stand firm against any storm. His hands would be blistered by dusk, but there was a deep satisfaction in that ache. He once told a neighbor, "When you pour your own effort into building something, it gets to know you." The bridge spanned about 30 feet, sturdy enough for his ATV or the small utility trailer he used for yard work. It crossed a narrow creek that glittered in the morning Sunday. On quiet days, he would stand there with his fishing pole, boots sunk in the mud, watching minnows dart beneath the shadow of his own handiwork. Life was slow, simple, and peaceful until Judith Bramwell moved in. She arrived like a sudden, furious wind that had forgotten how to stop blowing. A new homeowner and the recently appointed head of the Riverside Meadow HOA, she wasted no time in issuing directives. Trash cans must never be visible from the street. All fences must adhere to the HOA's approved color palette. All yard decorations now required board approval. Trenton initially dismissed the first few notices. He paid his dues on schedule, maintained a pristine yard, and was a bother to no one. But Judith, it seemed, had locked him in her sights, patrolling his property line twice a week with a clipboard in her hand. She would pause just long enough to capture photographs, until one day she called out, "Mr. Veal, you're aware that any structures extending beyond the designated residential line must be reviewed by the board, correct?" Trenton looked up, the buzz of his hedge trimmers falling silent. "If you're referring to the bridge, it's been standing since before I even bought this place. I simply made repairs." Judith offered a smile that held no warmth. "Well, any modifications are considered new construction. I'm going to need the documentation." "Documentation? For fixing something that is mine?" She refused to answer directly. "It's protocol." Then, she simply walked away. That was the initial spark. Weeks later, as construction began on a few new homes just across the creek, the situation was primed to ignite. Trenton started to notice something strange. Deep tire tracks cutting through his lawn, leading directly toward the bridge. His first thought was a teenager taking a shortcut, but then his eyes landed on it, a cement truck, slowly crawling across the wooden planks. The very planks he had built with his own 2 hands. His rake fell from his grasp as he shouted, "Hey, you can't go through there!" The driver leaned out of his window. The lady up the street said this was a service road. Trenton waved his arms wildly. "It's not. That is private property." But the truck was already across. The planks groaned under the strain, and his chest tightened with dread. He watched as one of the beams began to buckle under the weight. The driver gave a lazy wave and drove off, leaving deep ruts scarring his lawn. Hours later, he went directly to Judith's house that afternoon, where her driveway was impeccably lined with decorative stones. Her flower beds were a display of perfect symmetry. When she opened the door, she looked almost delighted to see his distress. "Miss Bramwell," he began, "your construction crew is driving heavy machinery over my bridge. They're tearing up my entire yard." She raised a single, dismissive eyebrow. "Oh, that. They are merely using the most efficient route to the new development. It is not a route, it is my property. You don't have permission. Her voice, in contrast, was unnervingly calm and deliberate. Technically, Mr. Veal, that area could be considered for common use, as the creek runs along the shared boundary. Not that part of it. I've checked the maps. Well, she replied, perhaps you should have attended the HOA meeting last week. We discussed accessibility concerns for the new builds. Trenton felt his jaw tighten into a knot. You cannot vote to use my land. Judith gave a slight, indifferent shrug. The board approved it. As she closed the door in his face, Trenton stood there for a long, stunned moment. Staring at the smooth, white wood, he could feel a heat rising in his chest. It wasn't just anger, but something far heavier. It was the feeling that she didn't truly see him at all. To her, he was just an obstacle on paper. Back at home, he walked down to the bridge again. One of the boards had already been split clean across. He crouched down, running his fingers over the jagged crack as his tired reflection stared back from the creek. He looked older than he remembered. He sat there until sunset, listening to the frogs croak from the underbrush, trying to imagine how far this would go. But the trucks didn't stop, and neither did she. And that's when the real trouble truly began, unfolding over the course of that summer. Everyone in Riverside Meadow knew exactly who Judith Bramwell was. She was not the type to conceal herself behind emails or polite notices. She preferred confrontation, face to face, standing tall with a tone that was wrapped in absolute authority. Despite residing in the neighborhood for less than a year, she conducted herself as if she were its founding matriarch. Judith was in her mid-50s. She was perpetually dressed for a downtown board meeting, her uniform consisting of pressed slacks and a crisp white blouse. A distinctive key-shaped pin was always clipped to her collar. While whispers suggested a past in real estate, nobody knew the truth. What they did know, however, was that once she ascended to HOA president, her presence became impossible to escape. She decreed new mailbox heights. She banned wind chimes, and even dispatched a formal written warning to a retired couple whose grandson had left a basketball hoop out overnight. It was a level of control most neighbors quietly and resentfully tolerated. Trenton, however, was not wired for silent resentment. The first time she trespassed on his property was a Tuesday afternoon, moments after Trenton had finished patching a hole in his fence. He spotted her marching up the driveway, clipboard at the ready as always. "Mr. Veal," she called out, "we need to have a word." He wiped his hands on a rag. "If this is about the trucks, I've already made my position clear." "It's not about that," she interrupted sharply. "It's about your bridge. The HOA has received several complaints that it is obstructing community access to the creek." Trenton stared at her in disbelief. "Community access? I'm the only one who ever goes down there." Judith flashed that polished, dismissive smile of hers. "Regardless, we must maintain uniformity. The bridge does not align with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. It might be necessary to have it removed." He let out a harsh laugh, not of amusement but of sheer astonishment. "Removed? I built that bridge myself, and I respect that," she said, in a tone that conveyed the exact opposite, but private modifications that interfere with community harmony are discouraged. You understand." Trenton stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "Let me make something perfectly clear. That bridge is on my property. It doesn't interfere with anyone's harmony but your own." She didn't so much as blink. "Then I shall expect documentation proving that by the end of the week." And with that, she turned and departed, the sound of her heels clicking against his driveway. That night, Trenton ransacked his filing cabinet until he located his property survey. The bridge was well within his boundary lines, by nearly 12 feet. He took photographs and printed several copies. The following morning, he even drove to the Montgomery County Office of Property Assessment to get an official stamp. When he handed Judith the authenticated documents later that day, she appeared completely unimpressed. "We'll have to review this with the board," she said, tucking the folder under her arm. "There is no board," he shot back. "There's only you." She smiled again. It was the kind of smile that promised a war was coming. From then on, the tension between them spilled out into the open. Judith began inventing reasons to be near his property, claiming she was simply monitoring for compliance. Once, she even blocked a delivery truck at the entrance to his driveway to interrogate the driver about his delivery. Trenton's patience was wearing dangerously thin. "You don't need to monitor a single thing over here," he told her. "Everything is fine." "Mr. Veal," she said in her clipped, superior tone, "I'm simply ensuring fairness. Rules are what prevent neighborhoods from falling into ruin, or from being able to breathe," he muttered. But the moment that would truly define their feud arrived one Friday afternoon. The construction crews were back, and this time, 2 cement trucks were lined up behind Judith's SUV. She stood out front, pointing an authoritative finger toward the creek, guiding them over his land as if it were her own, when Trenton burst from his garage, his voice roaring over the engines. "Stop those trucks! You can't bring them through here." Judith's voice cut through the air, cool and sharp. "We are on a strict schedule, Mr. Veal. I suggest you refrain from interfering with authorized work." "Authorized by whom? The HOA? That's not a legal order, Judith. You're more than welcome to file a formal complaint," she retorted, just as the first truck lurched forward, making the very ground tremble and the wood of the bridge groan. Trenton's hands balled into tight fists, a portrait of impotent fury, as he watched the massive tires crawl across his bridge, the same structure he had painstakingly built, piece by piece. A sickening crack echoed across the creek, and a knot of dread twisted deep in his gut. By the time the truck had finally lumbered to the other side, the devastation was obvious. One of the main support beams had splintered. Judith didn't even grant it a second glance. She simply waved the driver on and sped away, leaving deep tire tracks gouged into Trenton's lawn like a final insult. That evening, Trenton stood on his damaged bridge, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, assessing the ruin. His neighbor, Cole Finney, a retired mechanic, ambled over from his yard. "She's really letting those rigs use your bridge, huh?" Cole inquired. Trenton just nodded, his jaw set like stone. "Claims it's for the good of the community." Cole scoffed at that. "Community? My backside. That woman just gets a thrill out of being in charge." They stood there in shared silence for a moment. The flashlight's beam illuminated the spider web of fine fractures spreading through the timber. "You're gonna have to get that fixed." Cole stated the obvious. "Oh, I will," Trenton replied, his voice dangerously low, but not in any way she's anticipating. Yet, before he could even formulate a plan, the situation was about to spiral into something far worse. The following Monday dawned like any other. The sun was a low, hazy orb over Clarksville, promising the kind of oppressive, humid, Tennessee heat that made the very air feel thick before the day had even truly begun. Trenton was in his backyard, meticulously cleaning his tools, when he heard that sound again, that deep, guttural rumble that instantly made his stomach clench. He dropped his wrench and spun towards the creek. Plumes of dust were rising in the distance. Not one, but 2 massive cement trucks were now cautiously making their way down the narrow, gravel path that led directly to his bridge. He breathed out a curse. "You have got to be kidding me." The lead truck slowed to a halt at the edge, the driver leaning from his window. "Hey, Mr. Veal, we got the green light to cross again, just like last week." Trenton stormed toward him, his voice slicing through the engine's roar. "Permission from who? That HOA lady? Judith?" "Right. She told us this was the shortcut to the new construction site. Said it was all approved." Trenton's boots churned the dust as he threw his arms up in exasperation. "It is not approved. That is my bridge. You drive that truck over it, and it's going to collapse." The driver just shrugged. "She's paying by the hour, pal, not me." And before Trenton could utter another word, the driver gunned the engine. The bridge shrieked in protest under the immense weight. Trenton's heart hammered against his ribs as the wooden beams bowed precariously. The sound of splintering timber ripped through the quiet woods. He screamed again, "Stop! You're going to break it!" But the driver just kept on coming. Once the truck finally made it across, the second one paused, its driver leaning out, looking suddenly uncertain. "You sure this thing is safe?" The first driver just laughed, slapping his steering wheel. "Feels solid enough to me," and that's precisely when it happened. A sound like a giant tree being torn in two. One of the primary supports cracked clean down the middle, causing the entire bridge to sag several inches. The 2 drivers stood frozen, all the color drained from Trenton's face as he felt the crushing weight of every single hour he had poured into that bridge. "Get it off!" he screamed, waving his arms wildly. The first driver scrambled to reverse, but it was already too late. The harm was irreversible. As the second truck dared to cross, the far side of the bridge buckled, plunging its rear tires deep into the creek below. A geyser of mud and water erupted. The driver cursed as he leaped from the cab, shouting, "You swore it was safe!" A knot formed in Trenton's throat. "I warned you both," he choked out. "That bridge was never meant for loads like these." The two men immediately began to bicker. Jabbing a finger toward the road, one of them declared, "We're calling the HOA." Trenton spun towards his house. "Fine idea. Go ahead and call her, and tell her to bring that clipboard of hers." In less than 20 minutes, Judith's black SUV tore down the gravel road. A plume of dust billowed in its wake as she emerged, sunglasses masking her eyes, her expression a complete blank. "What is the situation here?" she inquired. Her gaze swept across the disaster. "What happened?" Trenton fired back. "Is that your people have destroyed my property?" Her voice remained unnervingly calm. "Our contractors were following a designated route. If any damage has occurred, it will be addressed through the appropriate channel." "There are no appropriate channels," he snapped. "This is my land. You don't own it, and the HOA certainly doesn't own it, and I damn well didn't give you permission." Judith heaved a sigh. "Mr. Vale, we simply cannot have residents doing as they please. With communal areas, if every homeowner behaved this way, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. It is not communal." His voice cracked with rage. His hands were shaking. "That bridge is mine. I built it. Every single plank, every last screw, my money. My work." She tilted her head, her voice practically dripping with condescension. "Well, perhaps. You should have attended the HOA meetings before making such decisions." That final word, decisions, sliced through him like a knife. "You seem to operate under the delusion that private ownership exempts you from the rules. It does not. We will be sending you an invoice for the damages." "An invoice?" The word reverberated in his skull. He couldn't process what he was hearing as the two drivers lingered by their truck. They shot each other an anxious look. One of them mumbled, "Ma'am, it was your call. We were just following orders." Judith's head whipped around. "That's enough." Trenton took a step toward her. "You want to know what's enough? You, using people like your personal chess pieces to do your bidding." She let out a short, sharp laugh. "You've made this personal, Mr. Vale." "No," he said, his voice dropping to a low hum. "You did." For a tense moment, neither of them moved. The drone of cicadas filled the air, the only other sound being the steady drip, drip, drip of muddy water from the truck's frame. Then, Judith shattered the stillness. "I will have our insurance representative stop by sometime this week," she said, brushing an invisible speck from her jacket. "In the interim, I would advise you to remain calm. It is, after all, just a bridge." She turned and walked back to her SUV, but just before her hand touched the handle, Trenton spoke. "Have you ever built a single thing with your own two hands?" She paused. "I fail to see the relevance." "That," he said, "is the entire difference between us. You see rules. I see work, sweat, and time. You destroy what you can't possibly comprehend." Judith offered no reply. She simply climbed into her car and drove off, leaving Trenton standing there, his boots feeling like lead in the thick mud, the ruins of his bridge half swallowed by the creek. He felt the rage, of course, but underneath it all was a profound and hollow sadness. This was never about the wood or the money. It was about being crushed underfoot, yet again. That night, as he sat on his porch, his eyes were fixed on the black, silent scar of the creek, barely a silhouette in the moonlight. His next move was a mystery even to him, yet one certainty burned bright. This was far from over. He couldn't fathom the lengths he was about to go, nor could he predict how a single act of silent rebellion would send shockwaves through the entire community. Come morning, the familiar cacophony of hammers and engines once again assaulted the neighborhood's peace as Trenton stood watch at his kitchen window. His gaze was fixed on the wreckage by the creek, his bridge, half submerged, its timbers splintered and savaged. It wasn't merely broken, it had been utterly humiliated. The water flowing beneath it now a murky soup of splintered wood and ghostly trails of concrete dust. He had poured years into cultivating peace on that land, only to see it all annihilated in a few careless hours, all undone by outsiders who had no stake in this place. He poured a cup of coffee, but the mug betrayed him, trembling in his grip. Anger was an old acquaintance, but this was a different beast, entirely a cold, controlled, slow-burning fire that was about to be tested. Judith reappeared, a clipboard, her shield, and sunglasses obscuring her intentions, with two men in reflective vests trailing in her wake. "Insurance assessors," she announced, curtly. They offered no greeting, spared him no glance, and simply began to circle the bridge. As they snapped photographs and scribbled notes, Trenton emerged, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What's next? Are you bringing the press?" he asked. Judith's expression remained frozen. "This is standard procedure, Mr. Vale. We're required to determine liability." "Liability," he echoed, the word tasting like ash. "You mean for the people who trespassed and destroyed my bridge?" Her tone instantly became sharp as glass. "We are currently reviewing whether that section of land is, in fact, private property. Until then, your cooperation would be appreciated." He gestured defiantly toward the boundary markers, metal stakes he had driven into the earth with his own hands, measured to the inch. "Review all you like," he said, his voice low. "Those markers aren't going anywhere." Judith dismissed him completely, turning to one of her inspectors. "Ensure you photograph the supports," she instructed. "I have reason to believe they weren't up to code." And that was the final straw. Trenton laughed. It was a laugh born not of humor, but of pure, staggering disbelief. "You are truly something else." Judith just smoothed her blazer. "And you, Mr. Vale, are emotional. It's never wise to take these matters personally. Lady," he shot back, "you sent cement trucks to demolish something I built with my own two hands. You really think that isn't personal?" The inspectors exchanged an uneasy glance, but Judith, naturally, remained unfazed. She didn't even flinch. "As I stated, the board will handle it." When they were finally gone, Trenton stood in a profound silence, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His neighbor, Cole Finney, materialized at the fence line, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. "She's trying to push you," he observed. Cole continued, "trying to make you snap." Trenton met his gaze, his eyes like flint. "I'm not losing a thing. I'm taking it all back." Cole arched an eyebrow, silently asking for more. Trenton didn't reply immediately, letting the silence hang before he spoke, meaning, "It's time." It's time she learned that some people refuse to be walked over. For the next several days, he avoided her, yet her presence was inescapable. Official letters appeared in his mailbox. New regulations were emailed to the entire neighborhood. She even had the nerve to plant a temporary construction accesses sign, right at the edge of his property, a clear power play. He saved everything, every letter, every photograph. He kept every single piece of evidence, and late one night, he sat at his kitchen table, completely surrounded by a sea of paperwork. The old survey map lay unfurled before him. He traced the fine line of his property boundary with his finger, whispering to the empty room. "You crossed the line, Judith," he murmured. "You crossed it and assumed no one would ever push back." And in that moment, the idea began to crystallize. He wasn't seeking revenge, but something far more clever, a lesson that would force her to confront the consequences of her own hubris. And he would do it all without breaking a single law. The very next morning, he began the painstaking task of clearing the debris from the creek. He toiled for hours, hauling splintered planks and twisted nails into piles, the sweat tracing paths down his temples. But he never stopped. When the last piece of wreckage was finally gone, he stood over the creek, hands on his hips, surveying the void. His eyes were fixed on the empty space she had created. That evening, another notice from Judith arrived, a formal warning for damaging communal property. He read her words, folded the paper with deliberate precision, and placed it next to his coffee mug. He didn't dignify it with a reply. Instead, he devoted himself to his work, spending his evenings at the Home Depot in Hopkinsville, acquiring fresh lumber, heavy bolts, and professional-grade tools. The cashier, a young man named Evan, noticed his frequent visits throughout the week. "Building something big?" Evan asked. A faint, knowing smile touched Trenton's lips. You could say that. His real work began after sunset, under the faint glow of his workshop light. The light was a beacon, visible from the street. His neighbor, Cole, would sometimes stop by, offering a cold beer or a helping hand. "Rebuilding the bridge already?" Cole asked one night. "Not exactly," Trenton replied, his voice low. "I'm making improvements." Cole gave him a questioning look. "What kind of improvements?" "The kind that teaches respect." A low whistle escaped Cole's lips. "You're planning something, aren't you?" Trenton offered no denial, only the steady, deliberate rhythm of his hammer. His rhythm was constant and purposeful. When Judith passed by the next morning, she slowed her car to a crawl, watching him. "I hope you're following HOA standards this time," she called out condescendingly. Trenton didn't look up. "Don't worry, everything is by the book." She had no idea which book he was referring to. By the end of the week, the bridge stood once more stronger, cleaner, almost unnervingly perfect. Every plank was polished to a sheen, every joint meticulously sealed. But concealed beneath that fresh coat of stain lay a secret no one could possibly see. It was a hidden mechanism, brilliantly designed to give way under immense pressure just enough to ensnare, never to harm. He leaned against the railing that night, listening to the gentle murmur of the creek as the moon's reflection danced on the water. The light shimmered across the brand new boards. "Looks good," Cole remarked from behind him. Trenton gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It's ready." But before his trap could be sprung, one final confrontation was destined to set the entire neighborhood on edge. It would ensure that all eyes were watching when the lesson finally began. From the road, the bridge looked brand new. It was almost elegant. You would never guess the secret it held underneath. Every line was clean, every bolt perfectly placed. Judith drove past twice that week, slowing her SUV just enough to stare, but never long enough to stop. Trenton knew she couldn't resist a closer inspection. He wanted her curious, and more importantly, overconfident. He spent his evenings back in his workshop. He was surrounded by sawdust and the low hum of a small radio. On the table beside him lay the blueprints. They were sketched on simple notebook paper, marked with coffee stains and rough calculations, detailing a special frame beneath the planks. It was engineered to collapse in sections when a specific weight rolled over it, completely harmless to a person on foot. But for something heavy, like a cement truck, it would be a complete nightmare. The center would drop about 3 feet into a shallow pit lined with wet clay and water. It wasn't deep enough to pose any real danger, just enough to thoroughly humiliate whoever dared to cross it again. He called it his quiet justice. One evening, Cole stopped by, leaning his arm on the doorframe. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Man, she has connections, and you know how those homeowners association types are. They care more about paperwork than people." Trenton didn't miss a beat with his hammer. "She won't have any paperwork for this. I've got the permits, the survey maps, everything is perfectly legitimate. I even made sure it has proper drainage. There isn't a single illegal thing about what I'm doing." Cole grinned. "So, it's legal revenge?" Trenton smirked. "Let's call it creative boundary enforcement." They both chuckled, but beneath the humor was something sharper, the quiet, satisfying feeling of taking back control. Control from someone who acted as if they owned you. For days, the bridge sat undisturbed. Judith didn't call, didn't write. She didn't send a single email. It was an eerie silence, almost too quiet. Trenton had a gut feeling she was just waiting, lulling him into a false sense that the feud had cooled. But she wasn't the kind of woman to back down so easily. He was right. The following Friday, he noticed 2 unfamiliar pickup trucks at the far end of the street. They were big, loud, and caked in dried cement. He felt that familiar pulse quicken in his chest, the same potent mix of anger and anticipation that had been building for weeks. He stepped off his porch and sauntered down to the mailbox, pretending to check for mail as one of the drivers approached him. "Hey man," the driver said, flipping his sunglasses up. "We're supposed to be pouring for the property over the creek. The homeowners association lady said we could use this route again, claimed it was all fixed." Trenton stared at him for a long, heavy moment. "Yeah," he said slowly, "it's fixed." The driver nodded, hopped back into his truck, and started rumbling down the path. The gravel crunched beneath the massive tires as Trenton turned, walking calmly toward his porch, where Cole was already leaning on the fence. His eyes were wide. "She's actually doing it again," Cole called out. Trenton didn't respond. He just sat on the porch steps. With a coffee mug in hand, he watched the first truck reach the bridge and roll forward. The wood groaned faintly under the weight, but everything held. The second truck, laden with heavy cement, followed closely behind. Then, the sound began. It was faint at first. Then it grew louder, a soft groan that morphed into a deep, sickening crack. The driver shouted something in alarm, but it was far too late. The center planks gave way with a deafening snap, and the back tires sank straight into the clay pit below. The front half of the truck stayed on the bridge, tilted skyward like a stranded ship. Mud erupted, splattering high onto the driver's door. The driver threw open the door and jumped down. His boots slid in the muck as he looked from the destroyed bridge back to Trenton, who was still sitting quietly on his porch. "You did this," the driver yelled. Trenton merely shrugged. "It's my bridge. I built it. If it can't hold your truck, maybe you shouldn't be driving on it." The second driver slammed on his brakes. He refused to move an inch closer. "Man," I told you this was somebody's property, he grumbled to his partner. That's when Judith's SUV came roaring around the bend, just as he had expected. She stepped out, heels clicking, her face a mask of fury. What happened here? She demanded. The trapped driver gestured wildly toward the pit. Your shortcut just swallowed my truck. Judith's head whipped toward Trenton. You are going to pay for this, Mr. Veal. This is sabotage. He stood up slowly, walked down the steps, and approached her. Sabotage? That's a very strong word. I rebuilt my bridge. It's on private land. What occurs when people trespass is not my concern. She shot him a venomous look. Do you find this amusing? I find it to be justice, he replied softly. You destroyed it once, so I rebuilt it stronger. You told everyone it belonged to you. Now, the whole world gets to witness who the real liar is. The truck driver was already on the phone with his supervisor as another neighbor, Patricia North, emerged from her yard. Her phone held high, recording the entire spectacle. You all might want to lower your voices, she advised. This has all the makings of a major lawsuit. Judith snapped. Turn that thing off, Patricia. But Patricia didn't flinch. She simply stated, it's called freedom of the press, darling. Trenton couldn't suppress a slight smile. The neighborhood was finally paying attention. The authority Judith had worn like a royal crown was crumbling, piece by piece, before a live audience. Judith aimed a trembling finger at him. You are finished, Mr. Vale. I will personally see to it. Trenton met her furious gaze, his own as placid as a lake. You've already caused more than enough damage. The rest of it is on the record. She faltered. What record? He calmly lifted a small GoPro camera from its perch on the porch railing. This one. The color vanished from her face, but this public confrontation was merely the opening act, because when the police finally showed up, the true bombshell had nothing to do with the trap, but with what they found buried beneath it. The sirens screamed to life, arriving within 15 minutes. 2 Sheriff's Department cruisers crunched up the gravel road, their emergency lights painting the scene in flashes of red and blue. News had traveled like a brush fire. Half the community was now outside, phones held aloft, capturing every single second. It wasn't often that this kind of drama unfolded in the quiet lanes of Riverside Meadow. Deputy Rick Hanley was the first to step out, a tall, broad-shouldered man with his hand resting casually on his service belt. He absorbed the entire scene with one glance. A cement truck, its front end tilted skyward on a partially collapsed bridge, mud slathered everywhere, and Judith Bramwell standing there, rigid with fury and her arms crossed. He released a long, slow breath. All right, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. Who's running this show? Judith instantly jabbed a finger toward Trenton. He is. He deliberately rigged that bridge to give way under my construction crew's truck. This is a criminal act of sabotage. Trenton remained silent at first, allowing the deputy to take in the full scope of the situation. The thick, cloying smell of wet cement hung heavy in the air, punctuated by the faint hiss of pressure lines from the ensnared truck. After a deliberate pause, Trenton finally spoke, his voice perfectly level. Officer, that bridge is situated entirely on my property. I possess every legal right to repair, rebuild, or alter it in any manner I deem appropriate. Furthermore, he added, presenting a thick folder, I have the complete documentation to prove that fact, including all the county permits and time-stamped photographs. Deputy Hanley accepted the folder and opened it. Inside lay officially stamped property records, detailed survey maps, and a series of dated photos capturing the bridge's reconstruction, proving Trenton had meticulously documented every single stage of the process. Judith's voice climbed to a shrill peak. You can't possibly be taking his side. He engineered a trap. The deputy slowly turned to face her. Ma'am, did you possess explicit permission to utilize this bridge? Her jaw clenched. The HOA gave its approval for the route. The HOA is not a governmental body, Hanley responded with unnerving calm. If this bridge is located on Mr. Veal's property, then it constitutes private land. You cannot lawfully direct commercial trucks across it without his express consent. A deep blush spread across Judith's cheeks. That's not how this is supposed to work. HOA bylaws do not supersede property law, ma'am. Hanley cut her off. A low murmur rippled through the crowd of onlookers. A few neighbors shuffled their feet, trying to hide their growing smirks. In the midst of it all, the driver, still marooned in the muddy pit, had managed to climb onto the hood of his truck. "Hey," he yelled, "can someone please just call for a tow truck before this entire rig sinks any further?" Through it all, Trenton's expression remained perfectly composed. Yet, a profound weight was lifting from his soul. Weeks of frustration, humiliation, and stifled silence were finally coming undone, right before her very eyes. And it wasn't by his doing, but by her own blinding arrogance. Scrambling to seize control, Judith declared, "Officer, this man intentionally created a public hazard. He's a danger to public safety." Trenton calmly gestured toward his bridge. "Public safety? Ma'am, there is absolutely nothing public about this property. You trespassed. Your trucks have damaged my private property on 2 separate occasions. I merely restored what belongs to me. If someone chose to drive where they had no right to be, that's their own responsibility." Hanley stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Frankly, I'm not seeing any violation on his part. If anything," he continued, "what we have here is a clear case of unauthorized access to private land." The color instantly vanished from Judith's face. "You can't be serious," she stammered. The deputy, ignoring her, radioed for a tow crew. "My suggestion is that you all resolve this as civilly as possible. But if I were in your shoes," he added, turning directly to Trenton, "I'd be pressing for full compensation. It appears you have all the evidence you could possibly need." Judith whirled around, facing the small crowd that had gathered. "You all saw it. You saw what happened. He orchestrated this whole thing." From across the street, Patricia North's voice cut through the tension, her camera still recording. "Oh, we saw it. All right. We also saw your trucks tearing across his yard all week long. Maybe for once, the HOA should stick to its own affairs." That remark ignited a ripple of laughter. It started as a quiet chuckle, but soon grew louder. Judith turned, her eyes glaring at her neighbors, one by one, feeling the power she had always wielded, the intimidation, the absolute authority, now slipping away like fine sand through her fingers. Trenton stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You could have simply asked, Judith. You could have approached me like a neighbor, and we could have resolved this together. But you chose to treat me like an obstacle to be removed, not a person to be respected." For the first time in her life, she was utterly speechless. Her lips parted, but no retort came. The silence was broken by the arrival of the tow truck, its chains clanking and its powerful engine rumbling to life. It took the better part of an hour to wrench the cement truck free. Through it all, the bridge stood firm, though the scars of the ordeal were plain for all to see. Deep gouges from the tires, splintered planks, and chunks of hardened cement were now embedded in the wood. Before departing, Deputy Hanley walked back over to Trenton. "You handled this by the book. If she continues to harass you, file for a restraining order or get an attorney involved. People like her don't back down until they're made to." Trenton simply nodded. "Thank you, officer. I can take it from here." As the last of the police cruisers departed, the crowd started to disperse, but a few neighbors approached him first. They offered quiet pats on the shoulder, simple nods of solidarity and newfound respect. Cole was the last to approach. A slow grin spread across his face. "Well," Cole remarked, "I'd call that a decisive victory." Trenton released a breath that was almost a laugh, more like a lesson. Cole smirked. "Think she learned it? Not yet, but she will," Trenton said, his gaze fixed on Judith's SUV as it sped away, tires screeching in protest down the street. For all her fury and bravado, she had just witnessed firsthand what happens when you push someone beyond their limit. The bridge may have been the battlefield, but what truly shattered that day wasn't timber, it was her iron grip of control. That evening, Trenton found himself by the creek once more, flashlight in hand. Moonlight danced and shimmered across the water's surface. The creek was calm, perfectly still. He inhaled deeply, the air rich with the scent of damp earth and the sweet taste of quiet triumph. The entire neighborhood had watched him hold his ground. He did it without raising his voice, without breaking a single rule. It wasn't the satisfaction of revenge he felt, but the profound peace of justice, served cleanly and deservedly. It was an undeniable public defeat. Yet even after the trucks had departed and the road fell silent once more, Judith was far from finished, and Trenton was about to learn a harsh lesson. Humiliation doesn't always break people. Sometimes, it makes them infinitely more dangerous. 2 days crawled by. The mud around the creek had settled, but the tension had not. Judith Bramwell had gone completely dark. No visits, no letters, no HOA notices slid under doors. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was cloaked in an unnerving calm. It was too calm. Trenton didn't trust it for a second. People like Judith don't just disappear. They retreat, they strategize, they plot. On Wednesday evening, as the sun bled out behind the trees, he was sitting on his porch when he heard the distinct, sharp crunch of tires on gravel. Her SUV materialized again, halting precisely at the edge of his property. She didn't get out immediately. The engine idled for a long, heavy moment, its low hum sounding like a warning. At last, the driver's side door swung open. Judith emerged, wearing her signature blazer, but her expression was different this time. Tighter, sharper, her eyes like chips of ice. She marched toward the porch, her heels digging into the dirt, clipboard clutched in hand as always. "Mr. Vale," she said, her tone a tightly controlled blade. "We need to have a very serious conversation." Trenton didn't flinch. "About what? My bridge? Your trucks?" Her gaze darted toward the creek. "About the fact that you humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood." He let out a short, dry laugh. "You managed that all on your own, Judith." Her lips pressed into a bloodless line. "I had authority. I was acting under community guidelines. And you," she pointed at him, her hand trembling with barely contained fury. "You engineered my failure. You made me look like a fool." He leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "You didn't need any help from me for that. All you needed was a mirror." For a second, she didn't respond, and the air between them crackled. The cicadas seemed to buzz louder in the trees. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter, more venomous. "You think this is over, don't you?" "I think it ought to be." She shook her head slowly. "You don't understand how this works. People like you think you can just do whatever you want, just because you own a little patch of dirt. But neighborhoods need structure. They need order. Someone has to hold the line." Trenton stood up then, his shadow stretching long across the porch. "That order you're talking about is just another word for control. You use rules like weapons. I use them to protect standards," she shot back. "Standards don't mean much when you forget about people." Her voice cracked for just an instant, revealing something raw beneath the polished tone. "You embarrassed me, Trenton, in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what that does to someone in my position?" He paused, studying her. Maybe it makes them realize they aren't untouchable. She took a deliberate step closer, close enough for him to see the faint tremor in her jaw. "I could ruin you, you know. The HOA has power. We have connections. You think those neighbors who were clapping will still be cheering when your property fees triple? When your name is dragged through an endless mire of paperwork?" Trenton's voice remained even. "If that's what you need to do to feel better, then go ahead. But I am not moving an inch, not from this porch, not from this bridge, and not from the truth." Judith stared at him, breathing heavily, her knuckles white around her clipboard. "You think you've won, but you don't win against people like me. You only delay the inevitable." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you ever get tired of all this fighting, Judith? Of trying to claim every speck of dirt that isn't yours?" For a fleeting instant, she blinked, and her hardened expression wavered, but only slightly. Yet, it was enough for him to glimpse the profound exhaustion beneath her defiance, a vulnerability that vanished as swiftly as it appeared. "You will regret this," she finally uttered, her voice laced with venom. "I promise you." With that, she pivoted and stalked away, her steps sharp, quick, and deliberate. The SUV door slammed shut, spitting gravel from its tires as she accelerated away. Trenton remained motionless for a long while, watching until her vehicle was just a speck on the horizon, the sky above bleeding into a deep purple streaked with the day's final light. Cole ambled over from his yard next door, holding 2 bottles of beer. "So, she came back, huh?" he commented, offering one to Trenton. "Yeah," Trenton mumbled. "Didn't take her long." Cole twisted the cap from his bottle. "Did she threaten you again?" A faint, wry smile touched Trenton's lips, more or less. Cole took a long swallow. "Man, you'd think after that whole mess, she would have learned her lesson." Trenton's gaze drifted toward the bridge. Its timbers glinted in the fading sunlight. Some people just can't stand being wrong. To them, losing control is the ultimate form of disrespect. Cole nodded in understanding. "You going to do anything about it?" "No," Trenton replied, his voice firm. "Not yet. The more she runs her mouth, the deeper a hole she digs for herself." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with unspoken thoughts. The distant chorus of frogs from the creek was the only sound. Cole drained his beer and stood up. "Well, if she shows up with another truck, I'm bringing popcorn." Trenton let out a low chuckle. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." As darkness finally settled, he found himself drawn back to the bridge one last time. The water beneath rippled gently, mirroring the first stars as he leaned against the railing, feeling the coarse, weathered wood under his palms. He wasn't proud of the trap he'd set, but he didn't regret it for a second. It was never about revenge. It was about establishing a boundary, a line that should have been respected from the very beginning. He turned back towards his house, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. The immediate storm had passed, but a feeling deep in his gut told him something else was coming. It told him Judith wouldn't remain silent for long, and the next time she came for him, it wouldn't be with trucks or overt threat. She would use a weapon far more difficult to combat: his reputation. By Friday morning, the entire neighborhood felt different. The air was thick with a strange, unspoken tension. The kind that always follows a scandal, the one everyone pretends to ignore but secretly can't stop whispering about. Every cluster of mailboxes seemed to host the same hushed conversations. People noticeably slowed their pace as they walked past Trenton's house. Cars lingered a few seconds longer at the end of his driveway. He could feel the weight of their stares, even when no one uttered a word. Publicly, Judith Bramwell had gone completely quiet. But Trenton quickly understood that her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. That weekend, the Homeowners Association dispatched an email to every resident in Riverside Meadow. The subject line read, "Community reminder, safety, cooperation, and compliance." The message never mentioned his name, but the carefully chosen words left no room for doubt. It spoke of individuals who take matters into their own hands and warned against reckless behavior that compromises neighborhood safety. It also mentioned ongoing investigations into property violations. Trenton read the entire thing twice. Then, he leaned back in his chair. "She's trying to paint me as the villain," he muttered to himself. Cole called not 10 minutes later. "Did you see that email?" "Yeah," Trenton confirmed. "She's losing her grip and trying to save face. It's a classic move." Trenton rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not going to let her spin this story." That afternoon, he meticulously printed every single record he had. The property deed, the photographs, even the county permits, and the officer's official report from the day of the truck incident. He sent no message, wrote no defense, he simply pinned them all to his front door. It was as clear as day. Anyone walking by could read the truth for themselves. By sunset, half the neighborhood had stopped to look. A couple of neighbors gave him a subtle thumbs up, while others whispered to one another, casting nervous glances toward Judith's house. But the woman herself never came by, not that night, and not the next day. Then Monday arrived, and with it, the envelope. It was thick, official-looking, and stamped with the HOA's logo. Inside was a formal notice of fine, nearly $4,800 for unauthorized modifications to shared property and endangering community contractors, and failure to comply with board directives. Trenton stood at his mailbox, just staring at the number of fine of almost $5,000 for fixing his own bridge. He let out a slow, heavy exhale and walked inside. Cole stopped by an hour later. "She actually fined you $4,800, Trenton said, holding up the paper. "She's completely out of her mind." Cole leaned against the counter. "You understand what she's doing, right? She's hoping you'll fly off the handle. The moment you do, she gains leverage. That's her entire game." Trenton nodded slowly. "Then I'll play mine." He didn't yell, he didn't post about it online, nor did he show up at her door. Instead, he made one calculated phone call to the county office. 2 days later, a county inspector arrived unannounced, walking the property line with a clipboard of his own. He checked the markers and reviewed the permits. He took photos and asked a few quiet, direct questions. By the time he was done, his expression said everything. "You're in the clear, Mr. Veal. The bridge is within your boundary, and the paperwork is solid. She has nothing on you." Trenton managed a faint smile. "I appreciate it." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for that Thursday. It was open to all homeowners, and Trenton hadn't attended one in years. Until now, he walked into the community hall just as Judith was at the podium, standing beside a projector that displayed slides of recent neighborhood concerns. When she noticed him, her voice faltered. The entire crowd turned to see. "Well," Trenton said, his tone perfectly calm, "I figured I should stop by. seeing as I appear to be one of those concerns. Judith's lips thinned. Mr. Veal, this is not the time. No, he interrupted gently. It's exactly the time. He walked closer, holding a folder. Since everyone's been hearing only half of the story, I thought I would share the rest. He opened the folder and began to lay out papers on the table before him. His property deed, the county inspection report, photos of the bridge, and the official police statement. Each page landed with a soft slap. It was a sound that echoed louder than any argument. I tried reasoning with you, he said, looking straight into Judith's eyes. I tried following your process. You ignored it, you abused it, and you cost me a bridge I built with my own 2 hands. So, I rebuilt it, according to the law. And when your trucks trespassed again, I let the truth do the talking. The room was dead silent, except for the faint hum of the projector. A man in the back coughed awkwardly into the quiet. Judith tried to speak. You're twisting this into, I'm not twisting anything, Trenton cut in. I'm just done being silent. You use this HOA to bully people who don't fit your particular mold. But the rules are not your personal weapon. They're supposed to protect us, not control us. In the crowd, a few heads began to nod, even those of the other board members. The attendees shifted restlessly in their seats, until one older woman finally broke the silence. He's telling the truth. She fined my own son for having a shed painted the exact same color as his house. This has gone entirely too far. For the first time, a fissure appeared in Judith's rigid composure. This is slander, she retorted. No, Trenton replied, his voice low but unwavering. This is accountability. He began to gather his papers. He tucked them neatly into his folder, then let his gaze sweep across the room. All I ever wanted was to live in peace. But peace doesn't come from silence, he declared. It comes from boundaries. With that, he turned and walked out of the room. He left a stunned audience in his wake. By the weekend, word had spread like wildfire, only this time, the narrative was not against him. The HOA board convened an emergency vote. The following Monday, Judith Bramwell was asked to step down, pending an internal review. Trenton took no joy in the victory. He didn't gloat or celebrate. He simply went home, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat on his porch as the sun dipped low over the tranquil creek. The air itself felt lighter, filled with a kind of quiet he hadn't known in months. Cole soon ambled over, his hands casually in his pockets. Looks like it's finally over, Cole observed. Trenton smiled faintly. Not over, just balanced again. But as the neighborhood settled into a newfound calm, there was still one more chapter to be written, one final moment that would elevate a small-town feud into a lasting lesson. The next few weeks unfolded in a deep quiet, as if the world had finally taken a collective exhale for the first time in months. The grinding sound of trucks had vanished from the gravel road by the creek. The only noise Trenton heard now was the whisper of wind in the trees, and the soft murmur of water flowing under his bridge. His bridge, standing proud and unbothered, just as it was always meant to be. Judith Bramwell had scarcely been seen since that definitive HOA meeting. Her name still surfaced in neighborhood conversations, of course. It was whispered at mailboxes or during evening walks, but never with the same chilling fear it once commanded. She'd lost something far deeper than her position. She had lost her grip on people. Then, one late afternoon, Trenton was on his porch when he spotted a familiar figure approaching. Judith was walking slowly down the street, but there was no clipboard, no blazer. This time, just a plain gray sweater and jeans. Her hair was tied back, her steps uncertain. He thought she might just walk past, but she didn't. She stopped at the edge of his yard. After a moment's hesitation, she walked toward him. "Mr. Veal," she said quietly. "Miss Bramwell." The silence that followed stretched thin between them. The air carried the scent of coming rain as clouds began to gather overhead. "I came to apologize," she said finally. Her voice was no longer sharp, it sounded exhausted. "I went too far." Trenton said nothing, simply watching her. He studied her face, trying to read her intent. "I let the position get to me," she continued. "When I moved here, I just wanted to keep things organized, to make it resemble the communities I used to work with. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people as people." Her words hung in the air for a moment, fragile but undeniably honest. Trenton nodded slowly. "You don't have to explain it to me. Just don't let it happen again." A faint, shaky smile touched Judith's lips. "I won't." She took a deep, steadying breath. "The board voted to drop all the fines. I made sure of that before I stepped down." "That's good to hear." She turned to leave, but she paused halfway down the path. "For what it's worth, you were right about one thing. Control isn't the same as order. I just didn't see it until I lost it." Trenton leaned back in his chair, his expression softening as he watched her walk away. You never truly know the strength of something until it's tested to its breaking point. Judith offered a silent acknowledgement. With that, she turned toward the road, never once glancing back. As she vanished, Cole re-emerged from his house next door. This time, he held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Was that who I thought it was?" he inquired, as a faint smile touched Trenton's lips. "Yeah," he confirmed. She came to make amends. Cole passed him a mug and settled into a chair. "Well, I never thought I'd see the day." "Me neither," Trenton admitted, his gaze fixed on the bridge, its wooden planks glistening as a light drizzle began to fall. "But I'm glad it came," he added. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the gentle rhythm of rain on the porch roof. It wasn't a real storm, merely one of those soft southern rains that seems to wash the dust and tension from the very air. As it cooled the earth, the moment felt strangely appropriate. After a while, Cole broke the quiet. "You ever have second thoughts about setting that trap?" Trenton considered this for a moment before he spoke. No, not because it humiliated her, but because it demonstrated something important to everyone. It showed them that standing your ground isn't about shouting the loudest or picking a fight. Sometimes, it's about quietly proving your point, and then letting the truth do the heavy lifting. A grin spread across Cole's face. "You ought to get that stitched on a pillow or something." Trenton let out a small chuckle. "Nah, I think the bridge makes the point much better." The rain began to fall a little harder now. It tapped a steady beat against the wooden railing. Across the creek, the muddy pit was a distant memory, now covered with fresh grass and tiny wildflowers. It was as if nature itself had healed and moved on. By nightfall, the clouds had parted. The sky was left a deep Tennessee blue, scattered with a brilliant canopy of stars. Trenton stood by the bridge one last time, the steady sound of the creek flowing beneath him. He ran his hand along the smooth railing, feeling its solid strength not just in the timber, but in the principle it represented. He murmured to the quiet night, "Boundaries aren't walls. They're lines of respect. You don't build them to shut people out. You draw them to remind people where they have no right to tread." In the distance, a neighbor's porch light winked out. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood was truly at peace. Trenton turned and headed back inside. The screen door sighed shut behind him. On his kitchen table sat the very folder that had ignited the entire conflict. Inside were the property maps, the photographs, the permits. He no longer had any use for them. Justice had been served, not in a courtroom or by law enforcement, but through patience, persistence, and undeniable proof. Before switching off the light, he glanced out the window one final time. The bridge shimmered softly in the moonlight, a silent monument to everything he had built, everything he had protected, and everything he had learned. And perhaps, just perhaps, it served as a reminder to anyone who might be watching. A reminder that silence is not weakness, it is strength, biding its time. Because when someone crosses a line one too many times, the ground beneath them will eventually give way. Respect can't be demanded with rules or enforced by power. It must be earned. It's earned by knowing when to hold your ground and when to simply let go. Sometimes, doing the right thing means finding calm when every fiber of your being wants to fight. And when those in authority abuse their power, the most profound act of defiance is to simply refuse to be broken. If you've stayed with this story until the very end, remember that it's about more than just bridges and property battles. It's about understanding your own worth. So, if you believe in standing firm and defending what is yours with quiet dignity, subscribe to our channel for more stories from real life, offering further lessons and poignant moments that reveal just how formidable quiet strength truly is, how truly formidable it can be.